Welcome back to the 14th Jaipur Literature Festival. We're here in Digi Palace at the Darbar Hall in Jaipur. The festival is protected by DETOL. It's our pleasure to bring to you today Decolonizing Indian History, Manan Ahmed Asif and Priya Satia in conversation with Sunil Amrith. Did colonial historians deliberately skew the truth about Indian history? Were they guilty of a concentrated effort to create an Indian past of such horrific cruelty and oppression that it seemed to justify their rule and make it appear benign in comparison? Two leading post-colonial thinkers discussed the colonization and fabrication of Indian history with Sunil S Amrith and attempt to correct the misrepresentations of the past. Manan Ahmed Asif was born in Lahore. He is currently an associate professor of history at Columbia University. He is the author of a book of conquest and the loss of Hindustan, The Invention of India. He is the founder of the blog Chapati Mystery. Priya Satia is the Raymond A. Spruance Professor of International History and Professor of History at Stanford University. Her latest book, Time's Monster, History's Conscience and Britain's Empire, was among the New Statesman and BBC's History Magazine's Book of the Year. Sunil Amrith is a professor of history at Yale University. He is the author of 4 books, including Crossing the Bay of Bengal and Unruly Waters. Amrith is a 2017 MacArthur Fellow and a recipient of the 2016 Infosys Prize in Humanities. Please do remember to comment by typing it into the comment section below. Ladies and gentlemen, Decolonizing Indian History, Manan Ahmed Asif and Priya Satia in conversation with Sunil Amrith.
Priya and Manan, you have both written what I think are some of the most powerful, beautiful books this year or in many years. And they're seemingly about quite different subjects. But going back to them in preparation for our conversation, I'm actually struck by how much they speak to one another. And in some sense, I think they're both books about the colonization of South Asian history, which is distinct from but not unrelated to the colonization of South Asia. And I think that in both books, there are the seeds of other possibilities, ways that we might think of decolonizing South Asian history, as the title of our conversation would have it. Priya, a core argument in your book is that history as a form of knowledge was central to the colonial project. And I wondered if you could start by expanding on that argument a little bit.
Yeah, I definitely, the main argument of my book is about the way that historians, the central way historians and historical thinking figured in the conquest of India and in the story of the British Empire more broadly. And the argument I make is, we've always had history. All around the world, people have always told stories about the past, but you see a change in the 18th century in Europe and in England, right when this bout of conquest is going on in South Asia and other parts of the world. And they invent this new idea of history and of the purpose that history serves, where it's not just, you're no longer just telling a story about the past, you're using it to guide ethical decision-making. And what this does is that you've got these other inherited understandings of ethics, whether they're religious or cultural or from your community or whatever. But these philosophers, Enlightenment philosophers, start to think, well, we don't understand history as something that God intervenes in directly, but we do think that God or divine power exercises some kind of providential care. So whenever something seems offensive to our ordinary ethical sensibilities, there are times in which we need to set aside our qualms and trust in that higher providential force. And this means that things will not always seem ethical in the present, but in the future, you can count on them being vindicated. They're necessary evils. And so this idea becomes very enabling for all kinds of troubling things that happen in the empire. It really enables the empire to unfold the way it does, that the British have recourse to this way of thinking. So that's the main argument of the book.
And the idea of conscience is also at the heart of the book. And I think you've already sort of hinted in ways that plays out. But I wondered if you could say a little bit more about why conscience is so important to the story that you're telling here in Time's Monster.
Well, for two reasons. One is that I think with the story of the British Empire and the way people still try to understand it today, there's just a lot of emphasis on this idea of good intentions and people having made, accidental mistakes, and the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And it's about, people who are always trying to do something right and who are easy in conscience, or we have a lot of evidence of people who are often suffering from guilty conscience. Somehow conscience is at this kind of heart of the story about the British Empire in ways that it isn't so much in the story of other troubling modern events, and so, and so what I wanted to get at was what were the mechanisms that the British had, cultural and intellectual mechanisms that they had recourse to that helped ease consciences that were obviously very agitated many times. And you can see that in the way the diaries, official diaries, become very important to a lot of the important figures in this period, because they have troubled consciences, and the diary is the space where you sort of expiate your conscience and you count on future generations having access to it and understanding your conscience too. So I feel like conscience was very central to the imperial project all along, and the sense that we're going to have to be stoic and tolerate the fact that we're sometimes engaging in questionable things and count on the fact that the future will vindicate us, and we sort of have to martyr our consciences for the present.
Manan, your book is called The Loss of Hindustan, which is a very evocative title. And I wondered if you could start by saying a little bit about what is lost and how.
Thank you, Sunil, and thank you, Priya, for being in this conversation. It's really, truly an honor. I've learned so much from both of your work. So in a ways, what I'm saying is in conversation already with work that you've all already done. I think just as Priya was saying a second ago, one of the after effects of this conscious that needs to be assuaged. What is it being assuaged from? Like, what is the road that is leading us to hell? And I think in my work, that is the slow and methodical dismantling of a project, a conceptual world called Hindustan, that becomes a conscious project of colonial, what I call soldier scribes, who take it on both in terms of the military conquest of various principalities and polities in the subcontinent, but also a conquest of its past. And the conquest of the past, the writing of history itself for them, constitute this dismantling that I try to trace. So the loss of Hindustan, in a sense, is a way in which the subcontinent had a long history, an 800-year long history of thinking about itself as a space, as a geography, as a collection of peoples, as a way of thinking about the past. As Priya mentioned, it's not that contra Hegel that we didn't have history, but rather both the erasure of our histories, but also the ethics with which we had, which we wrote our history, are both kind of part of this dismantling project. So the loss of Hindustan and the invention of India I see as coterminous projects that largely launch in the early to mid 18th century and sort of, I guess in one way reached their fruition with 1947. But in my book, I kind of draw a line in the first decade of the 20th century, where most of these ideas seem to have finally gelled into what we now understand as a Muslim idea for a separate homeland and Hindutva idea for, Hindustan.
Yeah. And it's really interesting that in some ways you're both working through different manifestations of a way of knowing that begins at the same time. You're both talking about this shift in the 18th century that comes with these warrior scribes. And I suppose, one of the core questions in our session description is the question of, did colonial historians deliberately distort the truth about Indian history? And I'd love to hear you both talk about that, whether that's the right question to ask and how you would think through it. Priya?
Who should I go first? Okay. Did colonial historians deliberately see, the word deliberate is challenging there. Definitely colonial historians. So, I mean, as a British historian, I've looked more at colonial historians who were writing the history of the British in India. And probably Manan has looked more at actual, how Indian history before pre-colonial Indian history was written. So, definitely there's a skewing of it, but I think they were in earnest. I don't think they thought they were skewing it, right? So I think there was definitely, if you look at probably the first serious account of the British in India is James Mill's history of British India. It's 1817, and he never goes there, but he's very confident that he can write this book regardless. And he writes a very different story of British India than earlier generations of sort of Orientalist scholars had. And it's much less apologetic about the British presence there, and it sort of lays out. So this is where you see the influence of that new kind of historical thinking, where it's actually, as much as it's historical thinking, it's very future oriented, where he's saying that India has not had, is very behind in its historical development, and the British arrival has enabled it to be put on a path of universal history that's going to be about progress, and the British presence is going to be sort of the handmaiden of that progress. And so it's all about justifying the British presence there, and he's very well rewarded for this book, which is so enabling for company rule in India. He becomes a very high-ranking bureaucrat in the East India Company, and his book is sort of required reading for anyone who wants to join the company's governing service in India. So there's definitely a link between historians and institutional political power, and there's definitely, it's very instrumental. It's openly instrumental in what it's setting out to do in the portrait of the British presence it puts in place, and the image of an anarchic, in India that can't get on historically without the British presence, that needs to be rescued from the Mughals and things like that. And those kinds of ideas, they reappear again and again in British narratives. But I don't think that they were lying or something. I think they genuinely believed many of these ideas because of the Orientalist lens through which they're always looking at India.
And I think that's the connection there with Manan's book. You just talked, Priya, about how a particular narrative of the Indian past was very important instrumentally to a vision of a providential or necessary British tutelage. And Manan, I wonder if that's important to your story in terms of how these British Orientalists and then in the 19th century British administrators of various kinds are starting to write the pre-colonial history of Hindustan.
Yes, thank you. I think I will agree with the ways in which Priya has laid this opportunity, right? These are opportunities for growth for particular bureaucrats, historians, that they can deploy a certain type of narrative that has particular valence, but also has a lot of explanatory power that itself becomes an engine, right? In my book, I think I call history a colonizing tool. And I see it very much like a railway is seen as an extractive mechanism, a mechanism of transportation, of moving ideas and then breaking them down for export. And one of the things that I think was striking to me as I began my work was actually I began with kind of thinking about these large, rather abstract philosophies of history that are being composed by figures like Hume, Voltaire, Kant, Herder, and very curious about, these are these schematic representations of what the spirit of history is and how it moves and what role providence or rational thought or reason plays in it. And I was curious about what are their sources for knowing about China? What are their sources for knowing India? Obviously this is 200 years of the Atlantic slave trade. This is 300 years of kind of a type of ethnographic description of the colonized world. what were in their, in their footnotes. And I remember when I was in Berlin, I actually went to Kant's library in order to kind of look at his physical books and see, and there I find the text that my book is about, which is Farishta, who writes in the 17th century. And what I found was that they took something that was a history of Hindustan written of the part of the 17th century, and then they deployed it in their philosophy of history with an argument that this actually proves the chaotic, despotic sense of Muslim past that was important for their political argument. And so, I want to add one figure to the argument that, already Priya has mentioned, James Mill, father of JS. But both had another teacher who I think was incredibly important in this kind of philosophical building, which is Jeremy Bentham and his utilitarian project of the pleasures and the pain, and that linking of how to count up the individuals such that the greater good can be. And that's precisely the kind of ethical logic which says, sure, you can have a quote unquote atrocity, but it will add up to the greater good for the greater whole. And that, I think, allows for the discipline of history, which is kind of filling out its philosophy in its kind of formal sense of at this period, allow them to create this social scientific veneer of objective, partial, unipolar times monster, as Priya has so wonderfully called it. And I think that's where my work kind of goes back to the pre-colonial, rather than linger with the 18th century that Priya's book is in.
One of the things that strikes me about both of your books is how clear you both make it that this process was never uncontested, that there are voices, from the very beginning of this British historical project in South Asia that provide counter histories and alternative narratives. And I'd love to hear from both of you, maybe starting with you, Priya, about that side of the story. What is the challenge? What are the other narratives that the British can never quite subsume or erase?
Yes, this was the really fun part of writing this book, or the part that made it politically productive for me. Just that there's always dissent within Britain and Europe generally, but also among colonial thinkers and the people on the receiving end of this thought. So if you think about someone like William Blake, right? I mean, he's right there in the 18th and 19th century, early 19th century, witnessing the emergence of this way of thinking, this instrumental way of thinking about history. And he objects to it in the moment right then. And then you see anti-colonial thinkers from the 19th century on objecting to it too, and offering other kind of ethical visions to contest it. And so I think, especially when you get into the early 20th century, you see this in both the activism of anti-colonial thinkers, like somebody like Gandhi, who's saying, we should not be instrumentalizing the present for the future. We are ethically accountable in the present. Civilization is not something that comes in the future. It's how you behave right now in the whatever ethical challenge you face in this current moment. You can be civilized or not civilized. And you see this institutionally too, because the British are building, all kinds of institutions of education during this period, especially from the second half of the 19th century. And you see, as part of the anti-colonial movement, an effort to say, let's not, Gandhi says, the education system that Thomas Macaulay, the historian, set up for us has enslaved us. And so there's, a boycott of British-made universities. There's, Jamia Millia Islamia is a university that's established to counter the kinds of social scientific teaching that were being brought in as part of the colonial project. Same with National College in Lahore. Same with Banaras Hindu University. I mean, Tagore's Vishwa Bharati, there are many instances of this where they're so aware of the way that colonial social science and history are enabling and underwriting the colonial project. And so there's a very strong effort to push back against that, especially in the era of, it's not a coincidence that this is also the eras of the 2 world wars, which really make anti-colonial thinkers and people all around the world really question whether, this whole assumption that history is going to be a narrative of progress. Obviously, what the Europeans are doing is very destructive. So maybe we need to come up with an alternate vision. And you see that echoed back in Europe too, where you have thinkers like E.P. Thompson or Walter Benjamin and numerous thinkers who are also starting to become very skeptical about this idea of progress and trying to reinvent history and its ethical terms for the late 20th century.
One of the things that I found in reading, even from the 17th century, Frishta's text, as I mentioned, his last chapter, we will call the very last section of his history, actually confronts the arrival of the Portuguese and the French and the German and the British to various sites in Malabar and Surat. And writing as a historian in the early part of the 17th century, I felt his words to be very prescient about the apocalypse that's coming. And he's very aware that, in a way, the project of history writing that he's creating, which is tied to a political project, a project of how to be a polity in Hindustan, he's very aware that I think he cites something like, he said, the Europeans may appear distinct and they may speak that they are against each other when they are in our court, but they are all unified in the enslavement project that they have intended to. So he's able to see that there is a colonial project that, and again, this is early 17th century. And what we see moving forward, I feel very strongly that the historiography on anti-colonial thought, especially the historiography that focuses on historical thinking, has not paid sufficient attention to the many, many modes and forms of resistance that the colonized peoples have always engaged in. Everything from the song to our textile, our fabric, to our food, to the ways in which we habitate and work and flourish, even under the weight of colonial oppression. And what I found in what I describe in the book, in fact, are these series of historians. They are kind of like the mirror image of the historians of Priya, who are writing in the late 19th, early 20th century, who are incredibly aware. They're all medievalists, hence my interest in them, but who are all incredibly aware that the battle about history writing is also the battle for the future of the subcontinent. That it isn't simply the fact that we are, discussing whether Akbar was great or not so great, or Ghaznavi broke X number of temples versus Y number of temples. They fully consciously understand that whatever they write, whatever they say, is a way to try to stop the partition, and they call it the division of the subcontinent. Again, this is before such a demand is actually made by politicians, that they can tell the future that's coming. And in that sense, I think the resistance and the implementation of a colonial thinking are both happening simultaneously, and they happen throughout. And so there is no period that I can say that the colonized did not resist this project of history writing.
And I think both of your books really do a marvelous job of, I don't know if recovering is the right word, but bringing us to some of those voices and opening our eyes and our ears to the arguments that have been made. And Manan, I'm so moved by the epilogue to your book where you talk about Shafat Ahmad Khan's address to the Indian History Congress in Pune in 1935. There's a prescience to it, but also a set of ethical commitments that you've just talked about, which I think are really powerful. Another thought struck me when I was preparing for this session, and that's to take the conversation in a slightly different direction. I could have imagined a panel called Decolonizing South Asian or Indian History in the 1970s, in the context of area studies, perhaps. And I wondered what you both thought about how different our moment is, what we mean by decolonizing South Asian history here at this panel in 2021, given the fact that, in a sense, some version of this conversation has been happening for a long time. And yet, clearly, there is an urgent need at this moment to have it on different terms that both of you are among those who are setting those terms. And I'd just love to hear you both say a little bit about what we mean by it now, as opposed to what that might have meant at an earlier moment in the development of this field.
Yeah, such a good question. Definitely, historians were having that conversation. Then I mentioned E.P. Thompson, and then subaltern studies movement comes about, and it's trying to do exactly this. But I think I think there was a limit to how far those conversations could go. Just 3 decades after independence, when decolonization is still unfolding, but there's also this Cold War happening, and there is this desperation almost in India, and Nehruvian India, to sort of prove that India, the hold of that liberal historical imagination is still so strong. So the 5-year plans and the developmentalist goals, whether it's the leftist version of that or the liberal version of that, there is this sense that we need to show that India can progress along certain a certain vision of development that they've inherited from the British, which is about railroads and dams and uplifting out of poverty and all those things too, and so there's less scope to actually just think outside the box of progress defined that way at all. So even though there's a recognition of the complicity of historical methods, and there are historians who are trying to think about history in a much more in a different way, as a much more redemptive project, culturally and institutionally, in terms of the actual unfolding history of the post-colonial Indian nation, the hold of the old and liberal narrative of progress, that 18th century understanding of history, of looking towards future vindication, that is still too powerful for this conversation to go as far as it could have and should have. And I think now, with these conversations about whether it's reparations or apologies or museums, are saying, well, we never fully aired this, and we never actually got past the past. And then with the looming or actually ongoing climate crisis, I think that's really putting paid to this idea that the whole world can be developed in the way that the British claimed they could, that universal vision of development, and sort of forcing us to scramble and recover other visions of what civilization can be and what it is to be civilized. And I think that's partly, certainly for me personally, that was very motivating. But so I think there is a kind of, Cold War sort of slow denouement of that idea, the influence of that idea of the liberal historical narrative of progress.
Manan?
Yeah, and I think I can add a little bit to that. I feel that in the past 30, 40 years, especially thinking through the early 80s with the really important critiques of colonial epistemologies that were launched by queer and feminist historians, black feminist historians, and thinkers who kind of, I think, moved race and gender and sexuality into the kind of center of any effort to think about historical method, and to any effort to think about the decolonial perspective. And I feel very strongly that the indigenous scholars who've also worked so hard over the last 30, 40 years to change our relationship to the kind of conceptual world of earth and environment. I feel that this particular decolonial turn, if there is a turn, I'm not sure, but if there is such a energy, obviously this energy is in the kind of roads must fall and reparations and in confronting European and American cultural institutions with the past that they were able to kind of gloss over in many respects, but fixating a little bit more closely on the historical discipline. I think if there is to be a decolonial turn, it's certainly one that has to build upon these critical interventions and to incorporate the voices of the indigenous, the voices of the Black and queer scholars who have been at the erasures, that have been at the erasing end of that historical tradition for so long. And I think when we rebuild from this, I've often given, recently I've given talks, and I'm speaking with, students and intellectuals from Balochistan, from Sindh, from Kashmir, who are critiquing not only the colonizing impulses in the colonial period, but also the colonizing impulses in the nationalisms that we are currently facing. And so for them, they say to me, Manan, you're talking constantly about the British or the Dutch, but we are facing a colonial majoritarian politics in the governments of Pakistan or in the governments of India or in the governments of Bangladesh. And I say absolutely. And the answer isn't that we stop doing the critique of the colonial period in order to, raise claims against Hindutva or Sunni Islamist majoritarianism, but rather we embrace this ethics of decolonial work that allows us to build alliances and create a stable ethical resistance possible against these majoritarian movements.
Yes, I wanted to add something, and then I think Manan kind of added it already, which was just the other big force that's calling on us to complete a conversation that's really started, as you said, Sunil, in the 1970s, is that obviously we didn't at that point put to bed the colonial narratives about South Asia's past. This idea that Hindus and Muslims are, ancient enemies, cannot coexist, that there was anarchy before the British came, and those kinds of ideas. And if you look through the thought of anti-colonial thinkers in the 1930s, right when the roots of the Hindutva movement are also in that time, as also the start of the movement for partition. You also have alternative visions of a joint Hindu-Muslim past, pushing very much against those British colonial narratives, whether it's in the writing of Maulana Azad or in Maulana Madani as well, who make very different claims about Muslims' ancient rootedness in the subcontinent and about the composite culture of Hindus and Muslims. And so I think the fact that those things weren't dealt with fully in the 70s, and you saw and it's sort of the afterlife of partition, in a sense, right? Is what remained on the table to be dealt with, and we're seeing the kind of monstrous way in which it's taking over politics in the subcontinent, and so making it much more urgent for us to finally wrestle with those narratives and offer more accurate and more compelling ones instead.
Particularly since so many of the narratives that are now sort of mainstream and circulating are those that owe the most to that colonial mindset of the 18th or 19th century in the way they depict the past. I mean, in some sense, there's a profound irony to that the sort of majoritarian forces of today are wedded to a notion of history that comes so directly from the moments that both of you are talking about. I wonder if we could just, in the last few minutes, shift the lens a little bit from South Asia to Britain. And I wondered, both of you, and indeed in my own work, probably most familiar with a British imperial intellectual context, but I wonder if you feel there's something distinctively British about this form of imperial amnesia? I mean, Priya, you suggested it a little bit when you were talking about the diaries earlier, the fact that you don't really have that centrality of conscience in other contexts. But I mean, I think we could extend that to the kind of intellectual history that you're writing, Manan, as well. Is there something distinctively British imperial about the phenomenon that we're talking about, but also is there something specific about the way in which empire is invisible in Britain as opposed to, France or any other former imperial power today? I mean, do we need to have this conversation more forcefully in some contexts than others? I wondered what you both thought about
that. Sure. Yes. I think the British themselves made so many consistent claims for uniqueness and exceptionalism, and that's why it continues to feel exceptional and the conversation acts exceptional. Of course, there are a lot of similarities between British imperialism and French imperialism, for instance, and there are echoes of similar conversations about the restitution of artifacts and things like that. And it so far seems that the French government is just ever so slightly more willing to engage in such acts than the British government. But I really feel like throughout the period of imperialism, the British were so adamant about how exceptional their empire was and how it was an empire that was not an empire and that was really spreading liberty. That myth of liberal imperialism, I think, and all that rhetoric about good intentions, I think, has made it the hardest one to unpack without us first ourselves letting go of the idea that good intentions are not the criteria for ethical judgment, that actually you are ethically accountable in the present. So long as we are attached to the idea that great men sometimes need to rise above ordinary moral standards, and in the future we will find out that that serves some higher purpose, some higher historical purpose, as long as we're still committed to that, it becomes very difficult to condemn the British Empire or for the British to get over the imperial hangover and to still hanker after, glory in the world, as you see in some of the conversations about Brexit, right? So I think it's that the fact that we're still attached to that, the thinking that underwrote British imperialism, that's made it harder to wrestle with it and move past productively. And I do think that I don't think empires erased in some sense in British curriculum and things like that, but in sort of public memory and triumphalist narratives of the past, it's only ever a good thing. And that's why the conversations about statues have been so central. Figures like whether it's Clive or Churchill or what have you.
Thank you, Sunil. I mean, I think, as the movement for Black Lives Matter protest went global in this summer, we saw, how myopic nationalisms are. Even the American nationalism that couldn't confront its own history of enslavement and dispossession of the Black community. And when confronted with the murders of its Black citizen this summer, retreated into a type of sort of screaming kind of fantasy, with which it said, no, this is not a systemic problem. This is not, something that we need to confront. And I feel very strongly that I think whether we look at the American case of this new city on the hill and New Jerusalem and the all of those types of metaphors, or the kind of old glory of the Roman Empire that is refracted into the British version, what we find is a white supremacy that creates this petunia of affective standing, using both the future. We whatever we did made a better future possible, as well as this past glory. And I feel that in the curriculums or in our general conversations, as intellectuals, but really in the way in which we write history. We have to take these matters on, and we have to make a stand, critical stand, against these types of ideas. I don't think it's really about the popular, in the sense that it's not simply it's at stake is not simply the opinions of a general person, but I think the ethical weight of a sorrow like the death of George Floyd has to emerge in the writing that we do, and to make that present injustice be significantly seen and heard in a history of injustices.
I think that's beautifully put, and I think speaks to what both of your books did for me, which was really just to sort of open up in a very powerful way at this particular political moment a sense of what our ethical responsibilities are as historians and as writers, and how we engage with the present even as we are studying the past, in ways that hopefully transcend the very pervasive mentalities, which I think Priya's book in particular that you sort of really put out there in terms of conscience, or in terms of history in the future, judging actions of the present in more favorable ways. So we've come to the end of our time. I just want to thank you both so much for a wonderful conversation.
Thank you, Manan Ahmed Asif, Priya Satia, and Sunil Amrith for such an incredible conversation and focusing on what we believe is the history of the past. You've really brought it into context, and waiting to hear much more from the three of you in the future. Thank you to our celebration partner, Diageo. Thank you all for watching and being such a great audience. Do remember, you can also view episodes on the front lawn. Please stay logged in and continue to view them over the next few days as we bring to you some brilliant speakers. As you're aware, we continue to struggle day to day to survive because the arts have been completely impacted by the pandemic. If you can, please help us by contributing to Teamwork Arts. And those of you who would like to follow us or would like to tweet in our support, please remember to use the hashtag Jaipur Literature Festival 2021, and our handles are at Jaipur Litfest. The festival and all of us are protected by Dettol. Stay safe, stay masked.